Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jenny Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn.
And we're happy. This is a Death and Dying 101 session with Ryan Seidemann this week,
Hey.
which we always love,
Yeah, these are
our
so much
favorites.
fun.
Before we jump into our questions for Ryan, or actually, these are his students' questions, and we're re-asking them on the podcast. But before we jump in, we want to give a big thank you to everybody who
Hmm.
purchased tickets for this year's Beyond the Grave event. We didn't mention it last week because we were right at the cusp of being sold out, and we didn't know where that was going to go. But now we can officially say the event is completely sold
Sold
out.
out.
This is the first time in the 5 years well, this is year 5, but in 5 years where we sold out in less than 2 weeks from putting the tickets on sale. It
Yeah,
was, we were both Diana and I were just like in a flabbergasted, like, we
yeah,
cannot
exactly.
believe
Just
this.
like that. We're like kept watching it and watching this. It was surreal to
It
watch
really
it
was.
sell that quickly. So
So
that's pretty cool.
we are
Thank
grateful to all of you because not only does it support our actors and everything for the event, but really ultimately you're helping us support the cemetery preservation, which is why we do this event year after year. And just knowing that it sold out like that, we're pretty sure next year we'll have to do 2 weekends or
you. Mhm.
something because we had a lot of people who were very sad that they couldn't get in this year. So,
And we are actually looking at purchasing more upscaled equipment to be able to do some um, stone resetting in that because you can only do so much with humans and a tripod. And so we've been looking at stuff like this and events. This event will help us reach what we need to be able to buy more equipment that we could do this on our own because our monument companies, our local monument companies are so overwhelmed with their own business. They just don't have time. They just don't have time to do this.
right. Now, I'm so excited. So thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone who has purchased tickets. We are looking forward to seeing you at the cemetery. Definitely say hi to us if you see Diana and I running around like chickens with their heads cut
Yeah,
off.
we'll be the ones running around chickens in our heads.
Yeah, we do it every year. But we are so excited. This year's going to be so much fun. We've got well, we always have great actors. I've never
Yes.
had a bad actor for this particular event, but they're going to be great. And the high school students are going to be a lot of fun again. So we're definitely looking forward to it. So thank you.
And the
Now,
weather is going to be amazing.
yes, it is. That's why we always choose the first weekend in October. We've never had a bad weather weekend that way.
Mhm.
So it's cool enough that it feels like fall, but like we're not freezing yet.
Mhm.
So we'll see what happens if we have to make it 2 weekends next year. Fingers crossed we can get two
Yeah.
decent weekends of weather before snow comes. So Ryan has been teaching, busy, 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 and answering all of his students' questions concerning death related subjects. And I really liked this round. Well, as I told you before we started, the one about space was especially interesting because it was not something I've ever really given any thought to. But there's a lot of great questions this time around, also pertaining to museums and excavations of cemeteries and discovery of cemeteries. And we've talked some of that stuff before, but you had some really good, like, in-depth ideas about how we do this and what's going on with this. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of this. And as we told you, it's kind of timely because uh, we have been trying to help Rachel,
With epic preservation.
yes, promote her bill in Massachusetts that she's trying to pass currently to prevent the sale of human remains, headstones, and other cemetery related items
Right.
at oddity shows and places like that. Uh, right now, it's not technically illegal, unethical, not illegal.
Right.
And she's in the process of trying to get that particular bill passed. And we did an episode with her not too long ago when she had submitted the bill. It's
We're
changed names.
introducing the
I've
bill. Yeah.
updated all of that recently on our website and everything to coincide with what she's now doing, because bills tend to do that. They change names and get new numbers assigned to them and whatever, depending on what process they're going through. So I liked the fact that you had all these questions, Ryan, because it kind of will answer some of what she's experiencing right now in her process to get this made illegal in the state of Massachusetts. But also, it just hopefully makes people think a little bit more before they just go buy like a skull or a headstone
Yeah,
from one
by
of these
something
places.
creepy. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's particularly timely elsewhere in the country as well, because the market for that sort of thing is quite active. And the federal government, under the prior administration, had made some arrests of folks that were transacting what had been otherwise donated remains for educational purposes, and people were stealing them out of the medical schools,
Mm.
and they were making their way into the illicit trade, and so yeah, it's an unfortunate situation. It's an unfortunate reality if that's what you leave your remains for, and then end up being a curiosity on somebody's mantle.
Which is
Um,
crazy to me. So actually, then let's actually start with that particular question.
Are there any current incentives? Well, this is a good question for a person to donate their body to science. If not, if we establish incentives, would it help the issue of needing more bodies and obtaining them through whatever means necessary? Is that the one you were talking about?
Yes, that was when I was kind of thinking of it, kind of ties into what Ryan was saying about what happens when you leave your body.
yeah, so that's a good question, and the answer is multifaceted, because there are multiple pieces to the question. I guess we should start first with there isn't really a need for bodies donated to science such that people are resorting to illicit means of acquisition. So we're not dealing with a body snatcher scenario like we had in the US and the UK in the 19th century, early 20th century. There are sufficient
Fortunately,
bodies, yes, there are sufficient bodies that people are donating that make their way into the medical schools for teaching, into forensic programs for teaching and research. And then what a lot of people don't realize is that those remains will go, if not specified, they can end up in any kind of legitimate context where human remains are needed for testing. So, or practice of medical specialties, things like that. And that's something that, what is it, probably 25 years ago or so, Mary Roach talked about in her first big book on the postmortem lives of dead people. And, so in terms of leaving them, there isn't a need for people to donate remains, their remains just because there's a deficit, but they're absolutely used and necessary for all manner of legitimate things. And that the what they were, I think, referring to is in that lecture, I talk about this case out of, well, it was out of Massachusetts. Um,
of course.
yeah,
Sorry, Massachusetts.
where I know where the Harvard Medical School had some problems with some of their employees taking remains out the back door and giving them over to curiosity dealers. And then it also looped in some funeral homes and things like that. Not there. I mean, by the time this whole case came to light, it was in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, I think Ohio,
Mm,
Pennsylvania, and Arkansas. So it was a whole network.
Oh, wow.
And
crazy.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's not something that you really envision happening to your remains when you donate them. You would like to think that they are used for teaching purposes, educational research, what have you, and then that your family receives usually the cremated remains, the
Right.
leftovers, if you will, back. Um,
I'm going to piggyback off of what you just said with a different
okay.
question now that you're saying that. So for a time, and this almost goes back to body snatching days, um, when we were trying to kind of legalize the idea of harvesting bodies so that people wouldn't steal them out of the graveyards anymore. And then they talked about using, and I don't remember if this was even a US thing or maybe this was only in the UK, but they were like, we'll use the bodies of criminals. Like they don't get a say in what happens to their remains after they've died. Is that still something that happens in a modern contest or
No.
context anymore? Okay.
No, it's not. But yeah, it was in both places. They did do it here as well. There was just an awful lot more of it in the UK because by the 19th century, the UK had a very robust medical teaching program, but the acquisition of remains was left to just executed criminals, and that wasn't supplying enough bodies for the demand for medical students. And so the medical students would take matters into their own hands and, go acquire bodies, sometimes out of the cemeteries. And, then there are famous cases like that of Burke and Hare in Scotland who were murdering people for
Right.
their bodies. But no, and at the same time here, our medical school system was still in its infancy. So there just wasn't as much of it here, but it absolutely did exist like that.
Okay.
Uh,
I know I had read about it and then I couldn't remember what happened with that. And I knew there was legislation around it too at some point because again, there was the idea of, well, we need bodies. How can we do this legally? Okay, let's use criminals. Like there's other ethics things that came up with that later, I'm sure, when that came to all of that. So, leading into that, then we'll go back. So, we were talking about how some of these bodies, and in this case in Massachusetts, in this ring that formed, these bodies, these are body parts, sometimes like maybe just the skulls or whatever, were ending up for sale online at oddities fairs, and probably other weird places where you don't even think of stuff. So, like, how do we? And then you have people, and then we have stuff in museums too, right? We've for decades, centuries, we've had
Countries.
bodies on display
Yeah.
in museums, and and it wasn't, I feel like, until the last 50ish years that it became more of an ethical issue of, well, what is it? Should we really be displaying these bodies? Especially like the mummies and stuff. Like I remember being fascinated as a kid. You go to the
Yeah.
museum and you're like, oh, there's a mummy and it came all the way from Egypt. But now in my 40s, when I think about that, I'm like, this person died however many centuries ago and was mummified, and their remains were supposed to stay where they were put, and obviously did not. And yet we've studied them. Um, so, we're going to take it to this question here. How do modern museums and researchers avoid replicating that same sort of framework while studying and displaying the human remains now?
So that has become a really big issue, like you said, about the last 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
And at least in the United States, that um, reconfiguration of how museums are managed, how research collections are acquired and managed, was driven in large part by the indigenous community, by the Native American community. Um, and it's not that they didn't know this prior to that time, but they seem to have found their voice as it relates to the protection of their ancestors' remains in the 1980s. And like I said, it wasn't just here in Native Americans were able to pass the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act through Congress in 1990. Um, but in 1984, you had Australian Aborigines who got a similar law passed. So they beat us to the punch there. And there have been similar laws in a lot of the former colonial countries, especially New Zealand, South Africa. Uh, Interestingly, Canada has not addressed this at certainly at the national level, which is a little surprising. But so, yeah, for the last 40-ish years, this has been a front and center topic in the indigenous communities and in the United States, especially by and large, the majority of our teaching materials and display skeletons were those of indigenous peoples.
Right.
And in a lot of cases, they were acquired under not such good circumstances. Um, and so there has been a reckoning, really, with the museum and scientific community on the one side, and the descendant communities on the other side, for this period. And it started out very rough.
Hmm. I
It
can imagine.
was a give us our loved ones back, and on the other side, it was no, you're stopping science. Well, it wasn't really that cut and dry. I think what we have seen with the majority of the museum communities and research institutions, anthropologists, is that they've come around to recognizing, you know what? Maybe we, as a profession, and I say this as an anthropologist that really came of age in that transition period, that, maybe we're not the best spokespeople for the dead. Maybe their descendants, maybe the descendants of those folks are. It's been a very slow process to come to that realization. Um, but as that has happened, you've seen, like I said, just kind of a reshuffling of um, that's a little too random. A reconfiguration of how these things are handled, and so you'll get even as recently as last year, I think, or maybe it was earlier this year, the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, which is
Mhm.
very famous for its display of human remains, implementing a no remains without consent policy.
Mhm.
And so what that means for their famous Wall of Skulls, I don't know. As I understand it, that's not that bridge hasn't been crossed yet.
Right.
But they're not going to be taking any more materials in that don't come with express directives. So body donations, essentially. Um, and that's a private institution. So that says something because it's not regulated by government funds. That is really a capitulation in on the private side. It's capitulation to really the tidal wave of how these professions have been viewing these things. And again, it's kind of the not our people, not our right is almost how it's gone. And interestingly, you go across the ocean, and in Europe, it's very different in the way of how Europeans, treat their own dead, and whether they believe it's ethical to display them, excavate them, what have you. And by and large, they don't have a problem with it. And that's fine. Those are the descendants of those people. If that's the way they want their ancestors' remains handled, good. That's good. They can make that decision themselves. But for the people on this side of the ocean and other countries that really had problems with extractive industries in human remains acquisition, sale, display, putting that power back into the hands of the actual descendants has been the way of the field. And, in my estimation, and not that anybody asked, but it's the right thing to do. And we recently here in Louisiana had, I think we may have talked about this last time, had a really spectacular opportunity
Mhm.
to work with the descendant community to bring back remains from another country. And we help to facilitate it as folks that, deal with human remains. But once it came to, and then what? We stepped back, left all the decisions to the descendants, and, they were empowered to make those calls and decide what was best for their people themselves. And so I think that's the right way that it should be now. It's taken me a long time to come to that realization. As somebody who really, has made a career based on
Mm.
studying people's remains. Um, and so, yeah, it took a lot of soul searching, not just, by me, but by an entire generation or two or three of scientists, um, and things still are not um, completely wonderful. And as
Right.
you point out, these things do make it into not just into onto display, but they make it into the marketplace. Um, and it's interesting that you mentioned that Massachusetts is perhaps considering a bill to criminalize that kind of activity. We passed a bill here in Louisiana in 2016 called the Louisiana Human Remains Trafficking and Control Act. And it was to not just clamp down on that industry, but to really make it clear that this has always been a prohibition. The sale of human remains has never been legal actually anywhere.
Right.
And, so while Massachusetts, I think, is going the right way of implementing or considering implementing deterrence to that, the authority to stop that activity in every state in the union already exists. And so then, Diane, to get back to your part of the question from earlier, which I somehow remembered, that, is there something that we should be doing to incentivize the
Yeah, that's
donation
right.
of remains? And that gets at a real dicey ethical question,
Mhm.
right? Because then you're saying, well, I'll give you some of my body pieces for some money. And, I mean, we laugh at it because it just sounds
Right.
bizarre, but there are people around the world who will sell their own body parts while they're still alive. And, kidneys come to mind because you can live without
Right.
one of them. But and that then dovetails back into the display education and research, because for so long that idea of an incentive for death, paying for remains, assigning a value to them, drove the markets in South Asia and in China, such that so many people were valued more dead than alive.
Scary.
That in the, I think it was 1985, India outlawed the export of all skeletal remains. And China has not yet done so, but it was particularly acute in India that people were being killed. Again, kind of like, in Scotland in the 19th century, people were being killed because their skeletons were worth more than they were alive. And so then it got into this very kind of vicious cycle. So incentivizing, unfortunately, I think the only, and this gets way into the philosophy of science and the philosophy and ethics of medicine that I probably shouldn't be pontificating on, but in superficial terms, it gets at, you, the incentive is you're helping humanity.
Right.
Because if we add much more to it, then there's incentive for you to do bad things.
Right.
Well, I
Um,
think sometimes people look at it, and I've known people who have donated family members to science because then the cremation or whatever, all that is free.
it's true.
And I
That
can
is true.
understand some of that. We just had this discussion on our last episode because we were talking about poverty and death and how that all goes hand in hand. And there's a lot of families that cannot afford funerals. They can't even afford the caskets anymore because caskets are ridiculously expensive. It's This is an option for some families. And you get the benefit of, hopefully they're studying the remains will lead science to find out whatever they're looking for, depending on what they're studying. But then they can get the cremation done, and it does do something with the remains that doesn't cost the
Right.
family thousands of dollars.
Right.
And that's great, I
Yeah,
guess.
there's a
And
side
that,
benefit to it.
like,
Absolutely.
and we still do need, I know, cadavers for a lot of different medical reasons and scientific reasons. I know most of the studies that we've done on the human brain, we can't do until after somebody is dead because we can't.
That is a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I know that makes it really hard. And that's the organ that comes to my mind, that I know a lot of the research that they've done is,
Because it was your mind thinking of your mind.
I know, as a brain, thinking of the
Real
brain,
meta like that. Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
other
And
parts of the
so that's a
body we've been
fair,
able to study while people are alive, but brains have been a little trickier.
they tend to be encased in something. I'm not really sure what it is. But yeah, and so you make a good point too, that my earlier statement that, we have a glut of bodies you don't have to donate is not really, that's not a fair statement.
Right.
I wouldn't want to imply that people should stop donating the bodies. They shouldn't, and they are
No.
used in legitimate research for very important things, and just in training doctors and things like that, forensic scientists, what have you. So, yes, keep donating your bodies, but don't expect to be paid for them unless you want a free cremation, and that's
Right.
roughly what it amounts to. Yeah.
Right. Which, again, like I said, I think most people, the people, especially if somebody designates their body, they're doing it because they know it will help progress science, or they know
Mhm.
they lived with whatever condition that science is still trying to figure out a cure for. So they're like, yeah, take my body and do what you need to do with it. So with all of this going on, one of the questions that came up then is, should museums still display mummified bodies? And if so, what guidelines should be followed? So, or even that says mummified bodies, but I'd even think skeletal remains, because a lot of times the mummies are wrapped. So we're
Mhm.
not seeing the body, but there's also the skeletal remains of lots of different people that have been on display in museums for centuries too. So
Yeah.
should we still be
And
doing that?
I mean, the answer that I give to that, and again, this then gets so idiosyncratic, again, who the hell am I to say, but I will say, the answer that I give to that is ask their descendants. Um, if their descendants are okay with the display, with the research, what have you, within reasonable
Mhm.
limits, go ahead. But if their descendants are not okay with it, no, then they shouldn't be displayed, whether they are, like you said, skeletons or mummified remains or something like that. And, I think even here in Baton Rouge, we've got, I think, at least one Egyptian mummy on display at our Art and Science Museum. And I mean, we're a tiny little city,
Right.
so they exist everywhere, and
Oh,
there's
yeah.
just that there really is a glut of them, and um, but I would hazard a guess that most Egyptians probably wouldn't be okay with them being shipped all over the world as curiosities.
Right.
Um,
Well, and I'm pretty sure
so
most of the ones that we see now on display in our museums, at least here in America, I don't know about other countries, we've had them for a lot. Like, they came over
Mhm.
in
yes,
the Victorian era when that was all the rage to, do all this. And we weren't thinking of the ethical complications of all of this at the time. Not that it
correct.
made it right to do what they were doing. I'm just saying that's not what they were thinking.
Different
And so
mindset. Yeah.
That's right.
yeah, I feel like the majority of the ones that we see now are definitely not something that's been recently excavated.
You're absolutely right.
But
No,
without them,
it's
we
right.
wouldn't. No,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead. Sorry, Rain.
No, you're right about that, and those ethical questions were absolutely not being asked. And And the answer, though, from the descendant communities may have been different then. Um, so they did come over under different circumstances, but I'm not sure that really the same inquiry of the descendants shouldn't still be asked with regard to those
Oh,
two.
Oh,
definitely.
sure.
And because and I think not just in the context of human remains, but you see this playing out with a lot of material culture,
Mhm.
artifacts, monuments that were taken from these communities and put elsewhere.
Hmm.
And come to find out, you may have been within your rights at the time in the 19th century to bring this thing back to wherever. But hey, today they kind of want them back. And who are we to say no, that you're wrong? You can't have
Right.
that. You shouldn't think that. And that's not to suggest there aren't legal complexities in the return of such things too. There are. But yeah, my rule of thumb is ask the descendants. If they're okay with it, I'm okay with it. And if they're not, then we need to figure out how to get them to okay. And if that means not displaying, so be it. That's
Do
my
we
opinion.
do we know if Egypt has ever requested any of their, like I said, the majority of our mummies come from Egypt. I think there's some from other countries, but we know here in America, it's been a lot of our own indigenous peoples that have
Mhm.
had the problem. Has Egypt made, I know they've made requests for certain artifacts, but
Mhm.
I haven't heard anything about the mummified
You
bodies.
know, that's a fair question, and I will answer this as I do my students. I don't know. But I am more than happy to research this and get back to you.
I
And I mean that in all seriousness because I don't know the answer to that question. And you're right. Things like, obelisks and decorations from various tombs have made it in museums all over the world, and the Egyptians want them back. I get it.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, if they've been asking for the mummies back, it hasn't been as loudly as some of the artifacts. So maybe that's one we stick a pin in and come back to in a
Yeah.
few weeks.
It'd be interesting to find out just kind of what their descendants are thinking. I
Yeah.
mean, their religious practices have changed over the centuries and everything. So are they okay with them still being displayed for people to learn from? Or yeah, I'd be curious to know. I
Yeah.
mean, we
Me
learn a
too.
lot from the mummies, so I'd be
Exactly.
curious to know.
What would we not know if we had not had the opportunity to study them? But I think a lot of it depends on how they're used. If it's just for commercial curiosity, I think that's a little different
It
than
definitely
scientific.
seems, yeah, it
Yeah,
definitely seems more skeezy, right? That just doesn't kind of pass the smell test.
yeah.
Um, okay, maybe I shouldn't use that for dead people. But yeah, the ones that make it into commerce do seem a bit less legitimate. Um, and from the descendant communities that I've spoken to, who we've worked with to recover remains in the past that have made it into the stream of commerce, they are angry and
I don't
understandably
blame them.
so. Sure, sure. But it's interesting, Diane. I don't know that they're any more or less angry about the ones that they haven't consented to being excavated and brought into collections for study. I mean, yeah, me sitting here today talking to you guys, one seems, sleazier than the other. I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of cases, it's just kind of all bad.
With the ones that are being sold,
Mm.
and I know there's a huge fascination with death and everything around death. And there's a lot of people that do it. Do you find the people that are purchasing these items, whether it's the bodies or whether it's grave materials or whatever it is they're purchasing that they probably shouldn't be purchasing, are these like more often private collectors
Yes.
that are just, and they're housing them
They're
Yeah.
absolutely private collectors. And, one other thing to note about that is it's not just artifacts and it's not just bones. It's wet specimens too. It is soft tissue. And yeah, it's astounding, really, some of the soft tissue specimens that end up in the marketplace. And then we're starting to see what we think is an overlap between the illicit human remains trade and endangered species
Mm.
remains as well. So it really is, and by and large, I can't pin it down to a particular group of people
Right.
from saying it is private collectors.
Mhm.
No reputable museum that I'm aware of is engaging in acquisitions that way anymore. But I mean, historically,
Currently.
that's how they got them.
Right.
Well, yeah.
But yeah, it's almost exclusively, as far as I know, private collectors. And some of them, it's enough to have a finger bone, and other people, they want the whole body, and it's something. So,
I, I guess it's like a serial killer. You wonder what makes their mind even want to collect. I
Mhm.
mean, I find it all fascinating. I find the body fascinating. I find the idea of everything fascinating. I don't need to have it in my house.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, I don't
I
need to
mean,
have that.
I got my plastic ones up here. They're all right.
I
Um,
I do have 7 plastic skeletons that live in my basement, except in October when they come out. And before that, they lived in our garage. And we did, I will say, when they lived in the garage in our old house, there were a few times people slowed down and looked because they saw all these skeletons lined up on the wall. But I swear they are plastic. We bought them at like Home Depot and other places. So,
Hey, look, I've had real ones in transit coming through the house for work, from
well,
when we're doing
you have a good
recoveries and stuff.
reason.
But they don't stay.
Yeah.
Right.
They do go home. Yeah, so it is, having seen behind the curtain into the folks that are trading in that universe, some special people.
I would say so.
Mhm.
Um, so this kind of leads into a slightly different area. Uh, and one of the first questions into this, and we may end up going back to some of these other questions, but one of the questions was how can public memory be made more inclusive without causing conflict with deeply rooted national or cultural narratives? This was a two-parter. This seems relevant in today's database or debates, especially over monuments and historical representation. Um,
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it's a timely one. It's a tough one, and there's no right answer to it. And so this semester, I'm teaching my upper undergrad and master's level historic preservation class. And we actually start the first week of class is on that exact question. It's on the monuments debates. And, the readings that I give them, one of them is an excerpt from former mayor of New Orleans, who wrote a book about him championing taking down the Confederate monuments here. And then juxtapose that against the positions that have been taken of they are in and of themselves historic things. Um, so and it's that kind of thing with the monuments, that when you get the question like this, and I've pulled them up, so now I'm looking at them, when they ask about public memory and inclusiveness and monuments and things like that, that's really where you're going, and you're never going to get a right answer. The consensus of my classes for, over the years have been, um, it cannot, these things can't be viewed solely as abstractions. That they have to be considered within their historical context, and the historical context of a lot of these things wasn't um, the commemoration of the individuals that they represent. That and we know this for certain for several of them in New Orleans, they were intended to intimidate, and that's why they were put up. And, I don't think anybody is necessarily saying destroy them. But maybe they shouldn't continue to be in places where they can continue that memory of um, times when
Intimidation.
people weren't as well,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. So how can public memory be more inclusive without causing conflict? It can't. Everybody's got their own opinion about what the right, quote unquote, right history is. And there is no right history. And so there's always going to be conflict over that. I mean, my knee-jerk response, again, just like it was with the remains display and analysis, is ask the people whose narratives you're telling. What is their history from their perspective? What's the narrative that they know? What's the narrative that they want told? Because there is no objective reality of history. It is all subjective from any one person's point of view. And so maybe that discussion of um, public history needs to just be inclusive, at least present all of the histories.
Yes.
But again, that's Ryan's opinion, as an archaeologist,
Well, and
and
I
that's
think
all it can
that's
be
where it
taken.
becomes very tricky too, because when you have when certain monuments especially affect different groups in different
Right.
ways depending on who's observing the monument and whose history is affected differently, you end up with the different stories. So how do we it like you said, we need to tell all the stories. We can't just tell one side or the other, because that's not helping us remember history properly in the first place. And one thing, and Diana and I have said it multiple times, history is not black and white. It has never been black and white. I know sometimes people try to make it that way, but it's not. And we're constantly learning new things. We find new information stuff. This is why we have people like archaeologists and historians, because they're the ones that are delving into things and finding documentation and finding other information so that we have a story. And we need to be able to, that's the stuff that should be in the public
Mm-hmm.
display, is everything that involves the history. And then, yeah, and like you said, as a whole, we check with the descendants again and we say, does this need to be in the public? Do we put it somewhere more privately? How do we handle it? And it's really hard, I think, sometimes to do that without a lot of emotions going into it too. Like
It
looking
is.
at it just in a logical standpoint can be really hard for people
Oh,
because
but
it is emotional.
Mhm.
we ran into that when we were in Santa Fe, and when the time when all the monuments were coming down, they took down the monument in the plaza, and it was dedicated, I think, in the 1860s or 40s, probably the 1860s. And it talked about when the soldiers came in and basically vanquished the savages,
Mhm.
Native Americans of the area. And so, of course, people took offense to that, as rightfully so, but and so they destroyed that part of the panel. There was different story panels, and so they ended up just taking it down. So there's just like a blank, I think it's in a box or whatever. It's just,
Mhm.
it's not there. But and some other people we were on this tour, and it's like, it's a shame because it gave an opportunity to expand on that history, in that this is what, in whatever date that the thing went up, this is what was said. But instead of, now we look at how they refer to the Native Americans, they were these tribes, and they lived, they could expand it on the history so much more than destroying just a little piece of it. And, it could have been a teaching moment.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a fine line to walk. Santa Fe is a particularly interesting place because it is such a curated
Mm-hmm.
town.
Mhm.
I mean, like that what we see as Santa Fe today, that was created.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yeah.
intentionally created, to be a tourist draw. Um, and so what you see in those kind of interpretive things. Uh, it's speaking to the 1920s, when, the boosters in town looked around and said, okay, we're going to have this color scheme. We're going to have, these kind of structures, and this is what our town's going to look like. And it has served Santa Fe very well from a tourist perspective. But that town is particularly interesting because it is such a curated history. Um, and there's a really good
Yeah.
book on it, actually. Um, uh, The Myth of Santa Fe, I think it's called. Charles Wilson is the author. It's really fascinating, to how the kind of the boosters of that town in the 20s created the image of what Santa Fe is.
Yeah.
But
I
I
found
know
out about it
that
on this trip and I was so sad.
I know that y'all didn't come here to talk about the history of Santa Fe, so I'll
No, no,
stop.
no. But it's like they there was an opportunity instead of removing that monument, they could have told a more inclusive history as that being a small portion of it to begin the story.
Mhm, mhm. Yep.
Well, and I think, speaking of curated histories and stuff, I think a lot of that also happened in the 1930s during the Depression. And this is when the government created what was it called?
Works Progress
The Works
Administration.
Progress, right. And they were trying to, in a lot of places, they were actually trying to increase tourism, and other things, because again, they're trying to get the economy up and going from the Depression. And so there were books written, and there specifically for the tourist industry, where they were very particular about what was going to be included in those books in order to attract people to certain towns in certain parts of the country. And so for a long, long time, I feel like that was the history we got of certain places.
Oh,
And it
definitely.
wasn't until more recently, I'd say in the last half a century, that we were like, I think we need to look beyond what was just written by these guys in the 30s and expand on what was actually happening. And again, I think part of that goes back to the indigenous communities coming out and saying, we want to know where our remains are, and can't we get them back and put them where they belong with us, and things like that. And then I think there was that push to be like, okay, let's start including all of this history and not shying away from the unpleasant parts of it, or the things that, didn't include certain groups of people anymore, because they're all important. So I do think in most cases now we're seeing that better in a historical thing.
Hope so.
Not always. And I think there's still a very long way to go. But like, I think there's more people out there that are more aware that we need to tell all of the story, at least as much of the story as we actually know for
Yeah.
different things.
It's kind of interesting too. The Works Progress Administration did some amazing data collection.
Oh, yeah.
And what they collected that didn't make it into the popular um, consciousness, we're now learning that exists. And one of the examples that I was thinking about just the other day, I was reading about it in a book, is the number of firsthand enslaved people's accounts of their lives under enslavement. They were still alive in the
Yeah.
30s.
Mhm.
And so they've got all of these interviews with them. And that's fascinating to be able to have that firsthand record. But yeah,
For
that
a
stuff
long time,
didn't
we
make it.
didn't.
Right.
Correct. And it's, that stuff didn't make it into the popular versions,
Mhm.
but it is still there. So,
Yeah. And I know in some cases it was depending on areas, and this would be a whole nother fascinating podcast in itself, is the works administration that they were doing. Some of it was politically motivated, what made it in certain towns were like, no, we don't want to talk about this, or yes, we want this included, whatever. So I'm glad that a lot of it actually did get saved, even if it didn't get published initially. Because,
sure.
like you said, now we're finding this
Right.
information and we're getting a whole new perspective on history that we were only guessing at before, when we were trying to think of how certain things were happening.
It's true.
We are going to pause our conversation with Ryan here for this week, and we will pick up with him next week to answer more of the questions that his students had in this last round. So we will see you then.
Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about today's episode, visit our website, Extraordinary Cemetery cemeterypodcast.com, where you'll find additional links in our show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Your support helps others find our show and discover all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories.
You can also follow us on social media for cemetery facts, photos, quotes, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery. If you'd like to help support us financially, you can donate a cup of coffee by clicking on the coffee cup icon on our website or YouTube, or purchase some of our fabulous Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery merchandise through our store link.
Until we meet again.